Hello and welcome back. In this video, I will show how to make all the cuts to construct a Kotatsu table using a table saw. Using an offcut from a beam, I first secure it to the sled and make a cut. Using the part that was cut off, I now turn it 90 degrees and make another cut. I have a piece with a width that is precisely the offset a board needs to be to produce a dado that is the exact width of the beam. Next, I take the rest of the offcut and using a marking gauge, I score the halfway point. This second aid is useful for setting the height of the blade to either the full height of the beam, which is useful for cutting the legs, or to the halfway point, which is useful for cutting the beams. With the blade set to the full height, I adjust the stop block to be 1/4 inches from the end of the curve. I set an offcut from the post earlier. Then I make the cut. With the post still secured, I readjust the stop block so that I can fit the first aid snugly in between. Then I make a second cut. Now I just clean up the wood in the middle by making more cuts. Now I have a dado that is the exact width of the beam. However, the dado is not centered, so I adjust the stop block accordingly. Now I'm ready to cut my legs for real. With these aids in place, cutting the 4 legs are simple. Line the leg up against the sled and the stop block. Make a cut. Insert the aid. Make a second cut. Then cut out the scrap in between. Rotate the leg 90 degrees and repeat. I do this for all 4 legs. If you are experienced and have a high-end table saw, then you can depend on the fence being straight and square and the measurements being accurate. However, with my cheap table saw, I really couldn't depend on the tools being calibrated. I have found that this method may be the simplest way to produce accurate cuts that I can repeat quickly. Having something physical to contact is way more accurate than depending on pencil marks and eyeing it freehand. And this is absolutely required when even 1/4 of a millimeter makes the difference between a dado that is too tight and a dado that is too loose. Basically, if I can see a gap when I put 2 pieces together, then the dado is too loose. I find that the dados may be a little loose, so I insert a slim shim when making the cut without the aid to narrow the dado just a tiny bit. Having cut all 4 legs, I demonstrate the fit on one of them with an offcut of a beam. Now I move on to the tabletop. I remove all the clamps. Depending on how well the 2 panels were matched, this will determine how much time I need to spend sanding. Be sure to wear a respirator when sanding to avoid inhaling the sawdust. I start by using a 60 grit sanding pad on my orbital sander. Please excuse the spasming. I wanted to fit everything into a 10-minute video, so I sped up these parts where there's nothing much to see. After making one pass across the entire tabletop, I use a 150 grit sanding pad. Then I switch to a 220 grit sanding pad, which will make the surface very smooth. Finally, I finish off with a 320 grit sanding pad. Now I flip the tabletop over. The back is much less well matched, so I need to spend a lot more time using the 60 grit sanding pad to grind away the unevenness. After that, I make passes with the 150 grit, 220 grit, and 320 grit sanding pads. I also make sure to empty the dust once the pouch fills up. Now I assemble the beams. There will be two sets. Edge beams will connect to the legs, and the center beams will hold the heater. Once I have those identified, I bring over the edge beams to the table saw. I measure 3/4 inches from the edge. This is where the dado will start. The dado will be the width of the beam, which is also 3/4 inches. I mark this on both sides. Then I clamp the beams together so I can make one set of cuts for all 4 beams. Making the cuts is similar to doing it on the legs. I align the mark for the edge of the dado to the edge of the kerf on the sled. I set a stop block against that. I secured the beams up against the stop block. I lowered the blade to be half the height of the beam. I make the cut. Then I slide the aid in, secure the beams up against it, and make the second cut. Then I clean up the scrap in between. I repeat the same process on the other end. Now I clean out the cuts with the chisel before assembling the beams on the tabletop. I use a clamp to help me push the beams together. Using the clamp shouldn't be necessary. If the beams don't fit together, the dados may be too narrow. Then, depending on how much I need to widen them, I would either sand the edges or use the table saw to shave off slivers. Now it's time to mark the center beams. I need to cut 2 dados in the center with a 29 centimeter gap in between them where the heater will sit. I measure out and mark the center of a beam. Then I use a measuring tape to mark the 2 dados that start 29 centimeters apart from each other. I also double check from the other side just to be sure. Now I bring the center beams over to the table saw. Cutting these dados also follows the same principles, but with a twist. Because the dados are in the center and the beams are long, there's no place to put the stop block. I use the edge of the fence on the sled as a reference point to put my stop block. Then I make the cut. I fit the aid in between the stop block and the edge of the fence on the sled. I make the second cut. Then I clean up the scrap in between by making additional cuts. Now I assemble the center beams. I lay the center beams on top of the edge beams. I align them and label each intersection between the legs, edge beams, and center beams. I also mark where the center beams and edge beams intersect. Now I disassemble the entire table to cut the remaining cuts. I start with cutting the edge beams. I line up one of the dados on all the edge beams and clamp them together. Then I cut them the same way as with the center beams previously. I realign the edge beams along the other dado, clamp them together, and cut them. I reattach the edge beams. Now I cut the edges of the center beams. For this, I switch back to using the regular blade on the table saw. I vacuum up all the sawdust on the sled. Then I remove the sled. With the table saw locked, I remove the insert, unscrew the nut and washer, and remove the dado stack. Then I install the regular blade, screw and tighten the washer and nut, and reattach the insert. Finally, I put the sled on. For cutting the center beams, I first line up the center beams along the mark for one of the cuts. I secure the beams to the sled, aligning the edge of the kerf to the mark for the cut. I adjust the blade height to be half of the height of the beam. I make the cut. I align the center beams along the mark for the other cut, secure them against the sled, aligning the edge of the kerf to the mark for the cut, and make a second cut. Now I place a stop block that is half of the height of a beam away from the edge of the curve, including the entire curve. With each center beam, I adjust the blade height to the length from the cut. I stand each beam up against the stop block, secure it, and make a cut. Then I do the same thing on the other side. This way I minimize the amount of sawdust I'm cutting, and I end up with these nice little blocks. I do the same thing for all of the center beams. Now if any of your dados were a little loose, you could try this trick out to tighten them. Cut off a little less of these edges than you should. When you assemble the table, the increased pressure will help to tighten the joints. Now I reassembled the legs and the center beams. I attached the center beam to the edge beams using a clamp. I've now built a Kotatsu table. Thanks for sticking through this video. I tried to condense it as much as I could while still providing a look at the entire process with all the boring parts. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. In the next video, I will be putting in some finishing touches on this Kotatsu table using a router. See you in the next one.